Tonight we are a country awakened to danger and called to defend freedom. Our grief has turned to anger, and anger to resolution. Whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done. Americans have many questions tonight. Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
Cyber attacks as a weapon of real war. According to the Wall Street Journal, the Pentagon has a plan now to respond against attackers and hackers, treating cyber attacks as acts of war.
The Obama administration is declaring war on cyber thieves, specifically the Chinese government, after a report linked it to a sophisticated cyber espionage campaign.
There's no question about it that cyber warfare, cyber attacks, cyber theft are absolutely the future.
Or the present. A new report from Mandiant, an internet security firm, says a Chinese military unit is responsible for cyber espionage operations in the U.S. and Canada. Fox News reports, quote, the White House is considering fines and other trade penalties against China or any other country guilty of cyber attacks. A former National Security Agency official says the hackers are mostly penetrating private companies as opposed to government agencies.
The types of things that most of these organizations are targeting is our intellectual property. For example, criminal organizations from either within the U.S. or outside the U.S. are looking at, private information for the typical individual in the country.
The report links China to more than 140 cyber attacks on U.S. companies, including Coca-Cola, and that can cost Americans big bucks, even jobs.
U.S. investigators say this amounts to economic espionage, where the Chinese can steal research and design and save billions, along with costing countless American jobs.
Hello, welcome to the interview here on France 24. Well, the building you see right now on your screen, on the outskirts of Shanghai, may not look like anything out of the ordinary, but an American computer security firm says that 12-story White Tower is actually the epicenter of a series of sustained hack attacks against U.S. corporations, dating all the way back to 2006. And now here's where it gets very interesting. That building also happens to be the headquarters of a secretive Chinese Army unit. Now, my guest today is joining me from Washington, D.C., Grady Summers. You are Vice President of Mandiant. And yours is the company that spent 6 years tracing hundreds of hack attacks to that tower our viewers just saw on the screen. And your company's just released a 60-page report detailing what you found. Thanks for being here. I want to cut right to the chase. The crux of your report, you says most of the hackers targeted victims in the United States industry. Smaller number were in Canada and Britain. I want you to tell me, who exactly are these hackers? Who are these people? What did they steal?
Well, our 6 years of research shows that these hackers are a group that we call APT-1, or Advanced Persistent Threat 1, are in fact members of the People's Liberation Army Unit 61398, that building that you were showing on the screen earlier. We have 6 years of research and over 141 victims, all of which point back to that same location.
So basically, you are able to sit there today and tell me with almost absolute certainty that there is a direct link between the location of those hacks and the fact that that's a Chinese Army unit.
That's right. It's not an accusation that we make lightly. We're certain of it based on the evidence that we've put together. The good thing, though, is that we've been very open with this evidence. We've released over 3,000 indicators, a 60-page report, a lot of details that other researchers can review and draw their own conclusions as well.
Chinese hackers have long been accused of targeting American companies. But tonight, China is lashing out against reports that those hackers may be working for the Chinese military, the China's People's Liberation Army, and they may have key American infrastructure in their crosshairs, things like the power grid and oil pipelines and air traffic control. Military involvement would bring the cyber threat to a whole new level, and it's something U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta warned about late last year.
The collective result of these kinds of attacks could be a cyber Pearl Harbor, an attack that would cause physical destruction and the loss of life, an attack that would paralyze and shock the nation and create a new profound sense of vulnerability.
In other words, war. It's long been suspected that the United States has itself launched cyber attacks, in particular on Iran's nuclear program. But in a major report, the New York Times now links China's People's Liberation Army to dozens of cyber attacks against the United States. The report traced the hackers to the doorstep of this building, a 12-story office tower in Shanghai that's the headquarters of Military Unit 61398. It's a name worthy of a spy novel, and is suspected of being ground zero.
I would say that they have made a very strong circumstantial case that it is coming from a PLA unit called 61398 that's located in a 12-story building in Shanghai. My colleague David Barboza wrote the story with me along with Nicole Perroth. He went out to the building last week. It dominates a sort of rundown neighborhood in Shanghai. It's got thousands of people working in it. The group that did the traceback of the attacks done by a group called Comment Crew, which is probably one of the largest of the Chinese hacking groups, they were able to take most of the digital forensics right back to the gates of this building. They couldn't take it inside for all kinds of reasons we describe in the story, but if it's not coming from this building, then you've got to believe it's coming from the noodle shops and restaurants that surround this building. Mm-hmm. Well, there are two elements of this. There's espionage, which is most of what the world has seen Chinese hacking groups do. And then there's infrastructure attacks to take over infrastructure. Let's deal with the first. Many American corporations have seen their intellectual property stolen. That's pretty classic industrial espionage. But if it's being done with state sponsorship, then the question is China turning its covert and its military forces over to help state-run industries or even perhaps non-state-run Chinese industries? The more worrisome kind of attacks are the infrastructure attacks. That's when you go in to learn the code work or the software to take over an oil pipeline or an electric plant or something like that. In the modern world where cyber weapons are the newest form of weaponry, the fact that your adversary would know that you could get into their systems and turn them on and off at any time, whether it was cell phones or air traffic control or whatever, might well affect your future behavior. So it doesn't mean that they're going to do it or there's out-and-out war, but it does mean that they have a capability to do this by remote control.
China unleashing its full spy power.
Let's return to the alleged link between China's military and a prolific hacking group.
Most cyber attacks are being carried out by teams inside the Chinese military.
China is officially out of control because don't look now, but proof today our sugar daddy is a thief.
Beijing became an overnight security threat last week after the American information security firm Mandiant identified a secretive Chinese military unit as the likely source of hacking against U.S. corporations.
Paint China as the new military threat to the world. It's a demonization of China.
Earlier this month, U.S. President Barack Obama signed an executive order aimed at strengthening America's cyber defenses.
We know hackers steal people's identities and infiltrate private emails. We know foreign countries and companies swipe our corporate secrets. Now our enemies are also seeking the ability to sabotage our power grid, our financial institutions, our air traffic control systems. We cannot look back years from now and wonder why we did nothing in the face of real threats to our security and our economy.
But reports about China's alleged cyber attacks have dominated U.S. mainstream media. Much less is being said about the Pentagon's decision to double down on its cyber war workforce, expanding from 900 to more than 4,500 employees. Experts say the move is indicative of Washington's evolving military strategy.
Cyber attacks as a weapon of real war. According to the Wall Street Journal, the Pentagon has a plan now to respond against attackers and hackers, treating cyber attacks as acts of war.
That China's People's Liberation Army is behind a years-long effort to steal American industrial and commercial secrets. The company, Mandiant, says about 100 American businesses were affected. It identifies the Chinese Army unit responsible, the city, and even the building where the hacking takes place. This is the building in Shanghai that Mandiant says houses China's cyber spies. It's the headquarters of the PLA's Unit 61398. Mandiant says the unit had carried out sustained attacks on a wide range of industries. According to Mandiant, the unit is staffed by perhaps thousands of proficient English speakers specializing in computer programming and networks. It charged the unit started its hacking as early as 2006. For years, China has been accused of hacking into American companies and government computers, but the Mandiant report is so full of detail that it seems hard to dismiss. One cybersecurity expert who has his doubts about the revelations is Jeffrey Carr.
The Chinese military is targeting U.S. companies, as well as smaller U.S. local, state, and federal government agencies and international governmental organizations overseas. That's according to Mandiant security firm. They were the guys hired by the New York Times after they discovered they were being hacked from inside of China. Before being hired by the Times, they were already on the trail of a group of hackers they identified as operating on the fringe of Shanghai, somewhere in the vicinity of this building. It's home to a Chinese military unit within the 2nd Bureau of the People's Liberation Army General Staff Department, 3rd Department, codename Unit 61398. Sounds like they caught the bad guys, right? Not so fast. There's one tiny hole in their logic. The Chinese military isn't even involved in hacking. I mean, just look at this footage from state-run CCTV. So China's military hackers have received a lot of attention recently, but they've been active for years. The New York Times was hacked for 3 months. NTD has been battling Chinese cyber attacks for over a decade. You see, the Chinese regime kind of hates us, especially because people inside of China really like us, because we're a source of China news that's not, propaganda and lies. They've hacked our email, satellite signal, website, all with the intention of stopping people inside of China from hearing the truth. Only the U.S. government and other media didn't really care until it started happening to them. Of course, maybe if they cared a few years earlier, China's military hackers wouldn't be as daring as they are today.
I'm Shelley Zhang. Last week, information security company Mandiant released a study. It showed strong evidence that the Chinese Communist Party's military, the PLA, is leading large groups of hackers, and they have attacked large corporations and governments around the world.
Cybersecurity threats from Chinese hackers targeting U.S. companies has taken center stage after internet security firm Mandiant pointed to the Chinese military as being responsible. So in light of this and reports by U.S. firms of internet security breaches, experts weigh in on what companies can do to protect themselves.
U.S. security experts worry Chinese hackers may plan more sophisticated attacks after a spate of hacking of U.S. companies traced back to China. Specifically, there are fears hackers could use information already stolen to launch fresh attacks. U.S.-based firms like Twitter, Facebook, NBC, and Wall Street Journal have all reported security breaches of their computer systems.
But we're now entering an environment where the world's largest economy will be a country that does not support rule of law, will be a country that is a principal threat in terms of cybersecurity, and will be a country where the most important economic actor is the state. And that means that American corporations that want to do business and compete in China will need to change the way they think.
Ian Bremmer, the president of Eurasia Group, says U.S. companies would need to team up to boost their cybersecurity defenses.
They're not going to pull out of China. They're going to share information. They're going to go to the trade association together, the U.S.-China Business Council, and they're going to raise this together. They're going to raise it with the U.S. government. An attack against one becomes an attack on all.
So part of our responsibility is to embrace technology the same way and to make sure that we use the cyber world to our benefit.
FBI Director Robert Mueller will address a conference later this week, briefing on the cyber threats and the need for more private cybersecurity firms to combat the growing risk of sophisticated cyber attacks.
A report by German news magazine Der Spiegel says the European Aeronautic Defense and Space Company, EADS, and steel-making giant ThyssenKrupp have suffered major hacking attacks originating from China. EADS makes Eurofighter jet, spy satellites, drones, and the Airbus and carrier rockets for French nuclear weapons. It says it came under major attack a few months ago. The attacks were considered serious enough to warrant a report to the German government. Hacking of the defense firm's blueprints and sensitive data could lead to major civilian and military disasters. Steel-making giant ThyssenKrupp also notified German authorities it had been subject to a, quote, massive attempt to attack its network administration in the U.S. from a Chinese internet address. Last month, security company Mandiant accused China's People's Liberation Army of more than 100 attacks on U.S. government agencies and major organizations.
In March 2010, Google effectively exited China's search engine market. This meant its 30% market share was up for grabs. The field was wide open for domestic competitors who wanted to take on China's #1 search engine, Baidu. China's government decided it too wanted a piece of the pie.
Cyber attacks as a weapon of real war. According to the Wall Street Journal, the Pentagon has a plan now to respond against attackers and hackers, treating cyber attacks as acts of war.
60 pages of evidence in our report, including 3,000 digital indicators, an actual video of the attackers doing their dirty work on victim machines. So this is not a baseless, casual allegation. This is based on 6 years of research, and we provide a lot of data to back up our assertions.
Walk me through the victims back in the United States who actually were the targets. Is it government targets? Is it corporate targets? Is it individual targets?
Sure, it's actually mostly commercial, corporate targets. It's really a who's who of American companies. Of the 141 victims worldwide, 115 of them were in the U.S., and it's a blue chip roster of companies in aerospace, defense, transportation, financial services, biofuel, clean technology. 20 different industries that we counted were targeted by this group, APT1.
You name this group Comment Crew. Talk to me about Comment Crew and sort of how they came together and what they do.
Right. Comment Crew is a name that a lot of security researchers have given to this group that we call APT1. They're called that because of the way that they do what's called command and control, the way they talk to their servers on the Internet. But what's most important is the evidence we've provided that links this Comment Crew, or APT1, to a unit of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, Unit 61398. That's important because this is the first time that researchers like Mandiant have been able to establish that link. We've long thought that these attacks have come from China. Now we've given evidence to show that not only do they come from China, but they're actually sponsored by the Chinese government.
So, Mr. Senator Ron Brownstein from National Journal, is the response only to toughen our defenses, or can you go on the offense once you know what the target, who is generating the attacks?
Yeah, we actually don't advocate going on the offense. We think that creates more problems than it solves. It's a really popular thing to talk about nowadays. But we believe there's no technical or legislative problem or solution to this problem. We think it's going to be a combination of better defense by organizations, but also diplomatic pressure that Washington can bring to bear on Beijing on this matter.
When you listen to the Chinese officials, their answer in part has been, yeah, well, we're the target of U.S. hacking, so there. So how do you bring diplomatic pressure if that's kind of the starting point?
I think it's very different. Certainly they're alluding to things we've all read about in the past where certain countries are attacking other countries. But never before have we seen one state-sponsored entity like Unit 61398 of the Chinese PLA attacking helpless commercial organizations in other countries. This is not government against government. This is a very well-financed, well-resourced government entity attacking organizations who aren't prepared to deal with that kind of an onslaught.
It comes less than a week since social media giant Facebook revealed it was targeted last month in a sophisticated attack identified as coming from China that the firm says also failed to compromise user data. The New York Times has been targeted recently too, the story making front-page news at the paper. The cyber attack on Apple comes within hours of a report by US company Mandiant that points the finger for all this hacking firmly at the Chinese, in particular a Chinese military unit based in Shanghai, which the report says has gone after 141 organizations worldwide since 2006. And this is allegedly the building in Shanghai that's believed to be at the center of the global hacking operation. The office is said to be occupied by Chinese military unit number 61398. The Chinese government denies the accusations. But experts say hacking is a way of gaining an advantage over countries that the Chinese are keen to try to outsmart.
An economic leg up, whether it's by stealing valuable intellectual property or by having some financial proprietary information. I think they lash out politically in some instances. We've seen with the New York Times, the Washington Post.
And he says the real worry is if the hackers turn their attention to delicate infrastructure like oil refineries and nuclear power stations. So as the hackers step up their threats, online corporate security will need to be beefed up even further if company files and customer safety are to be preserved.
These attacks mark a significant escalation of the cyber threat And they have renewed concerns about still more destructive scenarios that could unfold. Collective result of these kinds of attacks could be a cyber Pearl Harbor.
So the expansion is actually tiny by defense standards. Adding 4,000 people is really not all that big a deal. It's certainly not a big enough expansion for any contractors, defense contractors, or anyone else to make a huge amount of money off of. It's really kind of long overdue. We've talked about having a cyber force for quite a period of time, and if we're going to have one, it needs to have more than a few hundred people in it.
So 4,000 people, you're saying that that's not a huge expansion then?
Compared to the size of the American military and of the Pentagon itself, it is a tiny number. And given the importance of cybersecurity, given the fact that all of our defense systems depend on computers, all of our weapons, all of our military operations are completely dependent on computers, devoting fewer than 5,000 people to cybersecurity seems, a very small thing.
Well, first of all, you heard the term cybersecurity used multiple times by Scott, which is always what happens with government defenders. They coin slogans that are intended to sound very harmless but are quite misleading. The United States is not engaged in the process of only defending itself or even primarily defending itself against cyber threats. The U.S. government is the single greatest menace when it comes to aggressive cyber warfare. The United States government, along with the Israelis, is really the only country ever to use cyber weapons in a sophisticated and aggressive way, just like it was the only one to use the atomic bomb, and before that was the only one to use drone warfare. So a major part of this expansion is not about protecting our businesses from attack. This is always the fear-mongering campaign the government uses to justify expansion of power and money. A big part of it is making sure that the U.S. government can continue to destroy whomever it wants at will using sophisticated cyber weaponry. And the other thing I would add is this goes all the way back to 2002, 2003 to the Rumsfeld Pentagon, when there were secret reports issued that are now declassified that talked about how we have to wage war against the net. That was the slogan. And it talked about treating the internet as a militarized battlefield and making sure the U.S. government dominates offensively. This is a continuation of that mindset, and I think 4 times greater the number than previously existed to control cyberspace under the aegis of the Pentagon and the NSA is a very big deal.
Larry.
So there are several things here that are being kind of confused and a lot of issues being raised at once, and I think it might be helpful to separate them out a little bit. The United States does not currently seem to have any kind of well-thought-out strategic cyber policy. We are engaging in various kinds of cyber actions without any extensive public discussion, without any clear policy, even in the White House, as far as I can tell, about what we should be doing, how we should be using these weapons, what we should be using them for, and so on. This is a bit as though we were deploying tactical nuclear weapons without having had a Hiroshima and with no appreciation for how profoundly important these things could be. So I think we urgently need a national cyber policy, and we need to talk about what's missing there and what we need to do to develop it. This is very different than the question of should our military add a few thousand cyber specialists to the rest of all the military that we've got, which I think is a small thing and something long overdue, actually. The application of American national cyber capabilities to defend things, like to defend the power grid, as was mentioned, is a different issue still. If it were possible for the NSA and cyber force to defend the power grid by monitoring traffic and so on, we could be discussing whether they should be doing that. In fact, we have no capability of doing that. We can scan all the traffic and we can't identify malware. Malware can be disguised, malware meaning malicious programs, can be disguised in such a way that you can look right at it and you can't tell what you're looking at. So we could have a huge loss of liberty, a huge loss of privacy, and gain nothing from it as far as defending critical infrastructures are concerned. The problem with all of these things is just so much confusion and so little understanding of what's technically possible.
Let's just look at the culture in which this expansion is taking place. It's being done, as I indicated earlier, under the aegis of the National Security Agency and the Pentagon, two of the most secretive agencies in all of the federal government. They operate with extreme levels of secrecy without virtually any real democratic accountability, oversight, or checks. They have checks only in the most theoretical sense. And what I think is so critical to note is that especially the NSA, but also the Pentagon, has been engaged in a very intensive privatization campaign where so many of its functions are privatized, outsourced to private industry. And you have huge associations that are devoted to doing nothing other than accelerating the merger, which is really what it is, between the private sector and the U.S. government. When it comes to all these functions, it's incredibly lucrative for industry. And you referred to the revolving door. What you have are people like Admiral Mike McConnell, who is now at Booz Allen, who was previously the Director of National Intelligence under George Bush, who prior to that was also at Booz Allen, involved in these campaigns simultaneously to scare the nation into believing that we have to dramatically increase our cyber defense infrastructure, while at the same time representing the very industry interests who will profit immensely from that expansion. The entire culture of the NSA and the Pentagon is very much one where the revolving door ensures that these expanding contracts are very rarely for the public good and always for the good of private industry. And when you add to that what Larry Korb said, which is that all of this takes place in total secrecy, without any transparency, with no real legal framework, the assumption that this is going to be on the up and up and done in an entirely proper way is completely unwarranted. That's not how our government works. That's not how power and profit are exercised when done in the dark.
Cyber attacks as a weapon of real war. According to the Wall Street Journal, the Pentagon has a plan now to respond against attackers and hackers, treating cyber attacks as acts of war.
Well, I think it's very tempting to ascribe that kind of innocence to the U.S. government. The reality, though, is just look at what we do know about what the U.S. government is doing in this field. It is vastly different than the sort of fantastical descriptions that we just heard. The Washington Post, in its 2010 Top Secret America series, reported that every day, every single day, the NSA collects and stores 1.7 billion, that's with a B, billion, email exchanges and other forms of electronic communications between Americans and others in the world. The Obama administration has been attempting in all sorts of ways to ensure that it has full and complete and unfettered access to all forms of communication on the internet. It just extended for another 5 years what was controversial 4 years ago but no longer is, which is the ability of the U.S. government to engage in warrantless eavesdropping on electronic communications. And what we also know is that while the U.S. government and its defenders are standing up and saying that this expansion of this policy is necessary to protect the United States from cyber threats, what we know is that the only true cyber threat that the world has ever seen that has actually manifested in the world has come from the United States as the aggressor. And, you know, Larry Korb earlier said, well, we're not really sure if it's legal. What we know is that the Pentagon itself says that cyber warfare is an act of war. We're not at war with Iran. There's no congressional authorization to use military force against Iran, and yet what we know is that the United States government unleashed an extremely sophisticated computer virus that it developed with its private sector partners in order to destroy what the U.S. government admits is a legal program of enrichment. And so it is the United States that already has proven itself as the aggressor in this field. They themselves admit that part of this expansion is to intensify that aggression. And so the fact that this is all being done in secret and we don't have transparency is a reason to be more concerned about it, not less concerned, given the track record of the U.S. in this realm.
So we have a number of nation states that are engaged in very extensive cyber activity. The largest scale cyber campaign in the world is a long-term, ongoing campaign being carried out by China to steal all of the technology, all the competitively important business information from the Western world. This is just enormously larger in scale.
Right, but that's cyber espionage, not cyber warfare, arguably, perhaps, right? Or isn't there a distinction? Aren't we doing the same thing?
There is no longer a tenable distinction between espionage and seizure of property. if your economic future depends on your information, if your defense systems depend on your information, the security of that information, and you seize that information, that's seizing something of great value. That's a bigger deal than seizing a military base or seizing a warship, or it is actually a much bigger deal. It used to be that there was a difference between reconnaissance and seizure of property. There isn't anymore. In an information age, reconnaissance is seizure of property.
I mean, there's zero transparency. We learned today, as a result of what is an anonymous official going to the Washington Post, it's unclear how authorized it is, that this program is going to be implemented. But here we are talking about this program, and you asked each of us what the division is between offensive and defensive capabilities, exactly what it is that it entails. I mean, we know that there's going to be 4,000 more employees of the government devoted to this, which is a four-fold increase, but we don't know how many new programs there will be, how many contracts there will be, what those contracts will be for, whether it's subject to any legal accountability or framework. Nobody can answer the question that you're asking because it's all completely opaque. And that's to be expected because this world, the world of the NSA and the Pentagon, is in virtually every respect completely secret and opaque. It operates with very little democratic debate, democratic discussion, or democratic accountability. In fact, the only reason that we know that the United States unleashed the first ever sophisticated cyber attack on another sovereign country is because someone in the government told the New York Times that this had happened. And the Department of Justice and the Obama administration is so infuriated by this leak that the Washington Post reported just this weekend that they're going through people's emails in massive scale in order to find out who that leaker was and to prosecute them. So what little we know is already coming from unauthorized leaks that the Obama administration is desperately trying to plug. We're not headed in the direction of more transparency. We're headed in the direction of more secrecy, more prosecutions for leaks, more intimidation of whistleblowers, and that's why this is so concerning.
The report noted that there have been more than 140 different victims since 2006, and that the Chinese unit maintained access to those networks for nearly a year on average.
The study found evidence that linked it to a Chinese military unit. Prior to this report, anything you'd see coming from a security company or even from the government would indicate Chinese hackers. And with that, you could think of patriotic hackers, people working in the underground. There was never a direct link. And we found through our research that we could tie this to not only a military unit, but a location, their headquarters, their building located near Shanghai. If you were to walk inside this building, you would likely see thousands of computers. You would see teams of individuals working on maintaining access to and stealing information from Western companies. They do this as their job. This is a directed activity. This is not for recreational purposes. And it's been going on for, at least with this one group, APT1, for the last 7 years. That's right. We measure it in several ways. We track about 24 of these different APT groups from around the world, not just China. But
APT.
Standing for Advanced Persistent Threat. It's a term that was coined by the Air Force in 2006. And these groups, they have different characteristics. Sometimes we measure them by the number of industries that they go after. Sometimes we measure by the amount of data we take them to see. In the case of APT1, which is the focus of today's report, they're in 20 different industries, 141 different companies, stealing terabytes of data. And that's why we consider
Terabyte being a lot of
data, yes. That's why we consider them prolific. And the Chinese military uses these 5-digit codes to refer to individual units. And they don't necessarily tie them directly to the, say, 3rd Department, 2nd Bureau of the PLA. So we were able to unearth documents doing open source research. All of this is unclassified. That showed, for example, a letter from China Telecom to set up a circuit, in other words, to get internet access into this new headquarters building when it was constructed in 2007. And it said, we need to put a circuit in for 61398. And by the way, if you don't know how important they are, they're the 3rd Department, 2nd Bureau of the PLA. So they outed themselves in this document. So by finding those sorts of ties, we were able to center exactly what's going on there. We know exactly what they're looking for. This particular unit, we've seen them take financial plans, product development, usernames, passwords, email. They're trying to find out what these companies have, what they can use in their own sorts of products. They're trying to use them in negotiations. It's very interesting, the sorts of information that they take. So it's a difficult question to answer. When the military encountered the same problem, they had to stand up a separate unit just for the purposes of saying, this is the information that was stolen, what is the value? Do we have to change a defense contract? Do we have to re-engineer a plane? What are the things that we have to do? And that's the sort of thinking that we need to get the private sector engaged in. Well, I wouldn't worry necessarily as an individual, but as a company, I would download the report, I would take it to my IT or security staff and say, what are we doing about the issues in this report? And then at the higher level, at the strategic level, I would say, what is my government doing about this? What is the position that we're going to take with the Chinese? The government now has a tool that they can use in discussions with our allies, with the Chinese government, that's not classified. It's unclassified, and they can discuss it in an open manner. So
tonight we are a country awakened to danger and called to defend freedom. Our grief has turned to anger, and anger to resolution. Whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done. Americans have many questions tonight. Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
But our defense and military networks are under constant attack. Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups have spoken of their desire to unleash a cyber attack on our country. Attacks that are harder to detect and harder to defend against. Indeed, in today's world, acts of terror could come not only from a few extremists in suicide vests, but from a few keystrokes on the computer, a weapon of mass disruption.
The Pentagon now considers cyber attacks acts of war. The Wall Street Journal reports if a cyber attack produces the death, damage, destruction, or high-level disruption that a traditional military attack would cause, then it would be a candidate for a use of force consideration, which could merit retaliation. The position is part of the Pentagon's first formal cyber strategy. A Pentagon spokesman tells BBC the cyber defense strategy allows the U.S. to respond to online attacks using traditional military force. A response to a cyber incident or attack on the U.S. would not necessarily be a cyber response. All appropriate options would be on the table. Noah Shachtman, editor of Wired.
China on the attack, strongly denying reports it had anything to do with the cyber attack that apparently targeted several high-ranking U.S. government officials, members of our military, and political activists. Now, Google is alleging that China is behind a series of these hacks into their Gmail email accounts. In fact, Google now says today that they've traced the origins of this attack to a military vocational school in China.
Well, I think that we have known for quite some time that we've been undergoing cyber attacks from China, as well as in the 2.5 years that I spent over in Afghanistan, we were experiencing the exact same type of cyber attacks against our communication systems and our information technology systems from China. We're engaged in an economic confrontation with China, and China has clearly said that they do see us as an adversary and they're in a competitive struggle against us. So I think it's very important that we recognize that and we take the right and proper precautions. We have already stood up the United States Cyber Command because we realize that this is an incredible threat.
That, maybe you guessed it. Well, the Washington Post says experts familiar with the analysis say the snooping probably originated in China. And then there's this.
All I want is a little bit of proof. It seems so easy to point a finger at China and say, they must be the ones who've done this. And the proof simply isn't there. Now, I'm not saying that China doesn't hack into computers. I'm sure they do. But you know what? So do the Belgians, so do the Greeks, so do the French, the Americans, the Canadians. Everybody's at it. And it's just too easy to point the finger just in one direction.
So why?
China's state-run broadcaster, CCTV, may have proven that the Chinese regime engages in cyber warfare. The station aired a program in July that appears to show that the regime's military is actively involved in attacking dissident websites hosted overseas. The story made headlines yesterday, appearing in NTD's media partner, The Epoch Times.
The Chinese regime has long denied any involvement in cyber attacks, but a recent program by state-run CCTV may prove otherwise. A mid-July segment about the Chinese military reveals a top military university is engaged in cyber attacks against U.S.-based entities. The telling footage may have been easily missed. It only lasts for several seconds as B-roll between 11.4 and 11.10 minutes. It shows a custom-built software, apparently launching a cyber attack through compromised IP addresses belonging to a United States university.
There are individual universities behind some of the cyber attacks, and there are some individual units within the People's Liberation Army who are no doubt behind certain attacks. And because of that, you have to say that the Chinese government is part of the overall planning, the development of technology, and maybe even a targeting list, which gives me deep concerns about where this goes and the pervasiveness and the reach that China has in terms of the whole cyber warfare side.
Could be. The Pentagon hasn't announced its policy officially yet. They certainly haven't said anything about WMD, which you said in the lead-in. They've just said under some circumstances we might respond to cyber attacks with military force.
Cyber attacks as a weapon of real war. According to the Wall Street Journal, the Pentagon has a plan now to respond against attackers and hackers, treating cyber attacks as acts of war. I wanted to put the question today to our stream team: should cyber attacks from other countries be considered acts of war?
The Pentagon is sending a warning to hackers and to countries which back them that cyber attacks may be considered an act of war, and the U.S. could retaliate with military force. Brookings military analyst Michael O'Hanlon says under the new war doctrine, cyber attacks that cause widespread U.S. civilian casualties could be treated as an act of war by the Pentagon.
If a computer hacker sponsored by a government or even taught by a government brings down a generator in the United States that leads to half the country being out of power for a week and 300 people die as a result, I think you judge the outcome.
In the future, a U.S. president could consider economic sanctions or military force as retaliation to cyber attacks, but O'Hanlon believes the U.S. will most likely respond with cyber warfare.
Most of our responses will be of a cyber nature, and they will be either defensive or offensive. So either we'll try to protect our systems more effectively and have backups in case they do get hit anyway, or we'll figure out cyber responses. So it won't usually be the two polar extremes of just talking or bombing somebody.
Analysts say two countries in particular are potential sources for state-sponsored cyber warfare: Russia and China.
The Pentagon has concluded that computer sabotage coming from another country can constitute an act of war. This position, first leaked to the Wall Street Journal by an unnamed Pentagon official, gives the U.S. a green light to respond to hacking using traditional military force. This new stance represents an early attempt to secure a rapidly changing world in which a hacker could pose as much of a threat to U.S. nuclear reactors and infrastructure as a hostile country's military. The unnamed military official is quoted saying, "If you shut down our power grid, maybe we will put a missile down one of your smokestacks." One idea gaining momentum at the Pentagon is the notion of equivalence, which means if a cyber attack results in the same kind of death and destruction a traditional military or terrorist attack would, then it can be retaliated with force. A Rasmussen poll released on June 2, 2011 reveals that 53% of Americans agree that a major cyber attack should be viewed as an act of war to be met with military force. The release of the poll results follows just a few days after Lockheed Martin admitted they suffered a sustained and tenacious hack on its computer networks. On Wednesday, June 1st, Google announced that hackers, apparently based in China, had targeted Gmail accounts of U.S. government officials.
The United States has announced that cyber attacks can now be declared as an act of war, right? Meaning, if you want to try to shut down our electrical grid system, or you want to try to hit us on a hacking level via cyberspace or whatever, then we can take military means to prevent that from happening, or to strike back and not only retaliate through cyber warfare, right, but through, like you said, a military strike, right, which is very interesting. It's interesting for a number of reasons. One, because we've seen other governments target the United States in recent years. We don't know if they're governments, but all indications seem like the hack that was targeted against Google and users of Gmail, some high-level security people in the United States,
The United States is at war, not just on the ground, but in cyberspace.
The US military is developing software which will allow military personnel to create multiple fake online identities, also known as sock puppets. Their mission, go into chat rooms and other online forums and spread pro-American messages.